They were a private army that surged into the spotlight in 2022, a shadowy, brutal, and utterly bloodthirsty unit that distinguished itself in the worst possible ways during Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. Before long, they were the source of some of the most compelling high drama of 2023, as tensions arising from that same attritional war exploded into a mad dash towards Moscow, guns blazing, with the fate of Eurasia's dominant power hanging in the balance. Private military company Wagner, better known as the Wagner Group, has been Russia's biggest and most dangerous proxy force since it first appeared a decade ago, making its mark not just in Ukraine, but in Syria, Libya, and across sub-Saharan Africa. Anywhere they go today, their reputation precedes them as an utterly ruthless fighting force that views everything from torture to assassination to rape to pillaging as just another part of a day's work. But even though the Wagner Group is the best known of Russia's private military companies, it's not the only one, and not by a long shot. Across the past decade and a half, Moscow has found itself increasingly reliant on a wide range of mercenary groups, present in dozens of countries and more than happy to do the unsavory business from which the proper Russian military would rather stay separate. These Russian PMCs form a quiet, deadly shadow hand that you'd easily miss if you didn't look for it. So in today's episode of Warographics, we're going to peer into Russia's spiderweb of phantom armies and try and gain at least some small insight into what's really going on in perhaps the most extensive mercenary network in the world. After the chaos and confusion of Russia's immediate post-Soviet years, Eurasia's northern neighbor settled somewhat under the firm hands and then the iron fist of one Vladimir Putin and company. Over the past couple of decades, Russia has taken pains to preserve its place as a global hegemonic power. It's maintained a strong influence in its neighboring post-Soviet states and been a close friend to pariah states like Iran, North Korea, Nicaragua, and Eritrea, while keeping relatively warm relations with emerging powers such as China, India, and Brazil. Russia has made a strategic effort to appear as if it's at the cutting edge of military-industrial development and cast itself in strong opposition to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, both in its rhetoric and in wars of expansion against its neighbors Georgia and Ukraine. But maintaining a geopolitical umbrella like Russia's takes a lot of work, and with Russia's tendency to cozy up to dictators and military juntas abroad while actively threatening its neighbors at home, a lot of that work is going to be rather unsavory. Now, for decades, that unfortunate reality has made Russia perform a sort of balancing act. On the one hand, Russia wants to pursue its geopolitical goals with the partners of its choice against the enemies of its choice. At the same time, Russia doesn't want to alienate major players that it gets along with and doesn't want to find itself in a conventional, or worse, a nuclear war with the US and the European Union if it doesn't have to. Regardless of what the Russian trolls, who are almost certainly in our comments section, would have you believe, Russia has a lot more to gain by not engaging in a direct confrontation with the West, even if it believes that it would win such an engagement. Russia's key to walking that tightrope, at least thus far, has been the concept of plausible deniability. That is to say, it's very important that the nation of Russia and its senior leaders are able to deny knowledge or responsibility around actions that benefit them, particularly when those actions involve, let's say, crimes against humanity or other nasty business like that. Russia is absolutely not the only nation to do this, by the way. The United States, the EU, China, and every other geopolitical player on Earth need plausible deniability too, at various times, for various reasons. But it's something that Russia is particularly interested in relying on because, again, they've got to do a really precise balancing act in order to pursue their goals while remaining a part of a cohesive world order. And that is where the private military company, or as we'll refer to them for the duration of the war, the PMC, enters the picture. For Russia, private military companies are the crux of their effort to preserve deniability both in their immediate region and around the world. If Russia, let's say, has reason to protect the totalitarian dictator of another nation but doesn't want to present the image of Vladimir Putin kissing them on live television, then it's a PMC, not the Russian military proper, who will form that dictator's personal bodyguard. If Russia wants to protect precious mines on another country's territory in the midst of a civil war with a high civilian body count, then the people standing guard around those mines won't be Russian soldiers, they'll be members of a PMC. And if Russia wants to train, let's say, a pro-Russian group of rebels for an insurgency attack against a Western-backed government, then it's not Russia's own military who's going to do that work, at least not officially. Instead, dear old Vlad will ring up his buddies in the private sector, give them some orders, and sit back and do his best Dr. Evil pose as the dirtier business gets done for him. As far as what precisely a PMC looks like, a soldier's mileage may vary depending on which PMC they become a part of. In most cases, they'll operate either outside of Russian territory on foreign soil or in parts of Russia that are either strategically critical or under threat from a perceived enemy. They'll partner with both nation-states and non-state actors, and they typically have a wide range of responsibilities related to warfighting, from personal protection to guard duty to training to, well, actually fighting a war. Sometimes their goal is to operate continually in a certain area for a long duration of time, while in other scenarios, they're trying to get in and out of a hot zone quickly or train local forces who can carry on a mission in Wagner's interests after Wagner fighters depart. Often, their presence itself is one half of a direct exchange. Russia will support the security needs of a given client state or protect a ruler from coups by dispatching a PMC. In exchange, they get gold, gemstones, energy sources, lucrative contracts, foreign labor, or anything else they please. Deployments can be as large as the hundreds or even the thousands, like Wagner has done in Ukraine, or as small as a dozen troops or less, depending on the mission objective and the demands of a given environment. As they accomplish their tasks, they're functionally unaccountable, not beholden to leaders back in Moscow, not to their hosts in a foreign country, certainly not to any internationally recognized rules or norms on the treatment of civilians. Murder of civilians, rape, torture, targeting of local journalists and humanitarian organizations, and occupation of civilian areas like schools and hospitals have all been observed frequently in the areas where PMCs operate. PMCs will often rely on easily defined groups from within Russian society, aging military veterans, for instance, or ideological extremists who share a loyalty to a unifying set of beliefs. They're well armed, they're well equipped, they're financed either by the Russian state itself or by informal state affiliates like the Russian oligarchy, and critically, they're expendable. They'll operate both in battle and behind the scenes, sometimes taking a light touch to foreign manipulation, running influence campaigns, or engaging in targeted assassination. Finally, PMCs are actually illegal under Russian law, one last element of plausible deniability that shields the Russian government from accountability for their actions. After all, Russia couldn't possibly be using PMCs. I mean, they're illegal in Russia. How would that work? And look, at the time of writing, Russia's best-known PMC, by far, has been the Wagner Group. Although they now appear to be far more integrated into the Russian military, Wagner has historically operated as its own entity, serving Russian interests under the direction of the now deceased oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin. Wagner made headlines internationally in the years prior to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, taking a leading role in the insurgencies Russia propped up in Ukraine's western provinces, Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. After the full-scale war began in 2022, Wagner played a major part in the hostilities, sometimes relying on their more experienced fighters and the former Russian special operations troops within their ranks, and sometimes relying on mass deployments of Russian prisoners, who were offered amnesty by the Wagner Group if they survived a few months as cannon fodder in Ukraine. But around the world, Wagner's work has been a lot less publicized. They protected natural resources and engaged in other murkier activities in the Central African Republic, provided security to the leader of Venezuela, supported Libyan warlord Khalifa Haftar, and taken an active role in the Syrian civil war, even engaging in an unsuccessful direct attack on US forces in 2018. Now, we've covered the fall of the Wagner Group at length in other videos on this channel, but suffice to say that in the years of peak activity, the Wagner Group were the model of what Russian PMCs are believed to be. They're a versatile, experienced paramilitary unit able to fulfill a variety of service roles and support a wide range of mission objectives, always acting in the interests of Russia, but never self-identifying as representatives of the Russian government. They're cheap, typically drawing most or all of their funding from sources outside the official Russian government structure. When their soldiers find success, it's simply a happy coincidence that Vladimir Putin's interests are served, and when their soldiers die, there's no reason for those deaths to be reported to the Russian public. They're a private organization, after all, and everybody among their ranks signed the waivers before they started up. And it's those key distinctions that set apart the PMCs that we're discussing today. Now, the first PMC on our list was founded during or around the year 2008, an offshoot of an organization called Anti-Terror Orel. Founded by former members of Russia's Ministry of Defense, this splinter group has gone through a few names in its lifetime, but the one that we'll use to refer to it is Redut, Russian for redoubt, a word that basically means a supplemental fortification of defenses. And in their early years, Redut were just that, a supplement to the Russian military used to fortify their defenses against potential harm. Specifically, they did protection operations for Russian convoys traveling internationally, shielding them against ambush and attack from hostile forces without involving formal Russian soldiers, and they also looked after corporate real estate, military installations, and Russian diplomats, similar to how the American Wagner Group has done in Iraq and Afghanistan. Among the most prominent clients was one Gennady Timchenko, an oligarch and former KGB officer who had oil interests in Syria that needed protecting during the Syrian civil war. Functionally speaking, they've been extensions of the Russian military, allowing Russian oligarchs to directly use the military service without actually soliciting those services from the military. For most of its history, Redut has not been particularly big. The few detachments they had consisted of somewhere from 55 to 65 men each, and their weapons and transport came courtesy of the Russian military. But that changed when it came time for Russia to start making serious plans for its invasion of Ukraine. At the time, Wagner was Russia's largest PMC and was going to be a major player in the invasion, but Redut was brought in to take some of the stress off Wagner and handle some of the invasion's finer points. Particularly, as a joint investigation between Bellingcat, Der Spiegel, and The Insider, a Russian outlet, reported Redut was going to be responsible for the assassination of President Volodymyr Zelensky. Again, an important, nasty job, and one that Russia did not want to stamp with its official seal of approval. Redut's preparation for the job was not without controversy. They had been chosen by the deputy head of the Russian GRU, military intelligence, a general named Vladimir Alexeyev. He and his associates attempted to poach Wagner fighters and bolster Redut's manpower with the intention of making them into a formidable and knowledgeable enough force that they could storm Kiev and end Zelensky's life. As the joint investigation reported it, this ended up being a rather contentious topic between Alexeyev and Yevgeny Prigozhin, so much so that the two actually had a physical confrontation, but it wouldn't matter much. When Russia's attack on Ukraine stalled, Redut took shocking casualties as one of the advanced units that was supposed to be first on the scene, and in the following year the organization practically disappeared to lick its wounds. Or, that is, until after Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Wagner Group attempted a mutiny. Wagner's unsuccessful march on Moscow left a vacuum in the Russian PMC space that, within just a couple of months, Redut was already working overtime to fill. Not long after the Wagner mutiny, Redut started actively recruiting again and even poached one of the Wagner Group's most elite commanders, likely taking with him a whole lot of street cred and the interest of many Wagner fighters looking to jump ship. As of now, Redut appears to control a force of over 7,000 soldiers and is the likely choice to take over Wagner's operations in Syria. They're also actively recruiting for new postings in Africa, and according to some independent intelligence analysts, they're poised to become a sort of Wagner 2.0, filling in as Russia's primary PMC as their ranks continue to swell. Like Wagner, Redut has begun recruiting from high-security prisons and has been willing to waive some of the strict requirements for entry that Russia officially expects its PMCs to follow. Unlike Wagner, Redut also appears to be recruiting women into its so-called Boars Battalion to serve as snipers and drone operators. Finally, they've started to gain a reputation of their own for the same sorts of war crimes Wagner has been accused of, including torture of military veterans and civilians in Ukraine's far eastern reaches. Although expert opinions vary on just how directly Redut is controlled by the Russian Ministry of Defense, they're firmly under the thumb of Russian military intelligence. If they can establish themselves as a low-drama, high-effectiveness second iteration of what the Wagner Group was supposed to be, then they'll likely find work in Ukraine, Africa, and elsewhere for years to come. From Redut, we move over to Patriot, an organization that maintains its own close ties with the Russian MOD and military intelligence service. Unlike Wagner, Patriot is believed to be under the direct influence of Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, who some sources have described as owning the organization outright. As such, Patriot has been a crucial part of the protracted power struggle between Shoigu and Yevgeny Prigozhin, although that's a struggle that Prigozhin appears to have rather decisively lost. Unlike Wagner or Redut, Patriot is believed to comprise a handful of sub-entities clustered together under the Patriot label, mostly for ease of organization. Compared to other Russian PMCs, Patriot has long taken the best and brightest of the Russian military into its ranks, able to vastly outbid most other PMCs in order to get the most experienced and the most qualified troops. That includes a priority toward recruiting intelligence analysts and special operations soldiers who can carry out asymmetrical, unconventional warfare, as well as intelligence gathering and even delicate sabotage operations that have generally proven to be beyond the Wagner Group's capabilities. As such, they extend Wagner's same veneer of plausible deniability for Russia over Patriot's own operations, making themselves indispensable for operations that require discretion and a relatively lighter touch. Around the world, Patriot has generally stayed far less visible than Wagner, but they haven't avoided the spotlight entirely. Sporting a logo that harkens back to Ivan the Terrible's Personal Guard Corps and Death Squad, Patriot is thought to have thousands of employees, with many of them making well over triple what a person might expect to make at Wagner. They're also believed to have the option to make commissions on their work, which can range from direct action to intellectual exercises like propaganda and negotiation, as well as cyber intelligence and cybercrime. Patriot is known to have operated in Syria for some time, alongside Wagner and Redut in guarding the facilities of oligarch Gennady Timchenko, who we mentioned a moment ago. They've also done a reconnaissance work in the country, according to pro-Russian military bloggers, and identified Russians who went to fight with the Islamic State and other terrorist organizations in order to prevent their return to Russia proper. In Africa, they've deployed to Sudan, Gabon, and the Central African Republic, where they've been alleged to have participated in the murder of 3 journalists who were tracking secret Russian arms shipments in the area. In Yemen, they've supported separatist rebels while on the bankroll of the UAE. And in Ukraine, they've deployed during the Battle of Volodar in Ukraine's Donetsk Oblast. What they've done after the fall of the Wagner Group is tough to say, possibly because the elimination of direct competition between Sergei Shoigu and Yevgeny Prigozhin may have allowed Patriot to get back to their lower-profile work instead of participating in power squabbles. But undoubtedly, they remain a dominant force inside Russia's PMC ecosystem, wherever their operatives may be today. Next up, we've got to discuss the Sabotage Assault Reconnaissance Group, better known as Rasik. Unlike Wagner, Redut or Patriot, each of whom espouses ideology only after their primary objective as mercenaries, the Rasik Group is a deeply ideological unit with deep ties to Russia's far right. Often described quite accurately as a neo-Nazi organization, the Rasik Group traces its history back to 2009. The group was founded by a neo-Nazi named Alexei Milkhakov, who first captured public attention when he filmed and posted himself torturing and decapitating a puppy. And no, we didn't misspeak there, that is something that happens. Milkhakov has ties with the now deceased former military leader of the Wagner Group, a fellow neo-Nazi named Dmitry Utkin, and he picked up experience alongside Utkin in Russia's air assault forces or paratroopers. In the following years, his growing organization picked up recruits from Russia and Europe, providing them combat training as a private unit for hire. They first arrived on the scene in Ukraine in 2014. When they were a part of an ongoing Russian effort to support separatist organizations in Ukraine's Far Eastern Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts. The Rasik Group was present at battles over each of these oblasts' respective airports, and they carried out sabotage behind enemy lines, as well as participating in skirmishes and larger battles alongside other pro-Russian forces. In September of that year, they gained international notoriety, destroying a Ukrainian military convoy and then posing for pictures while surrounded by the dead. They remained at work in Ukraine until June 2015, when they left amidst a tiff with the leader of the self-proclaimed Luhansk People's Republic, and for a while, they returned to their camps, conducting firearms training, tactical drills, and survival skills courses. Even among Russia's PMCs, the Rasik Group has earned an especially nasty reputation, mutilating and decapitating corpses and living soldiers, engaging in systemic rape and torture of civilians, and executing prisoners, civilians, and children. In all regards, these actions have earned the Rasik Group little in the way of accountability inside Russia, where they operated and trained with impunity for years prior to the start of the full-scale Russia-Ukrainian war. During that time, Milkhakov and other prominent Rasik members popped up now and again in Syria, including once in reports that they'd been involved in the torture and dismemberment of a Syrian prisoner. But in 2021, Rasik appeared to congregate on Russian territory around Ukraine's Donbass region in preparation for later hostilities, with online indicators being that they seem to intend on causing trouble around the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. When the Russian invasion of Ukraine kicked off, Kharkiv Oblast is precisely where the Rasik Group went, and in the following months their fighters were condemned internationally and sanctioned by the US for, quote, special cruelty in their conduct during the battles. They took part in hostilities in and around the Ukrainian city of Izium, where after the city's eventual liberation, many bodies in mass graves showed signs of torture. In 2023, Rasik Group fighters posted a video to their Telegram channel in which they beheaded a captured Ukrainian soldier, while for much of the year they've been known to be active in and around Robotyne, one of the most embattled Ukrainian positions of the entire war. Also during the war, they've stirred the pot online, at one point asking their Telegram followers for intelligence related to border posts and military installations in the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, which are members of NATO, and would trigger a massive response if attacked. Despite these provocations, the Rasik Group still appears to be functionally immune from repercussions when their leaders return to Russia. Instead, they appear to be something of a useful evil for the Russian MOD, enthusiastic in their mission to sow death and destruction across Ukraine while disinterested in taking part in any political battles or power struggles against the oligarch class. They still crowdfund their operations relatively frequently, and at present they're believed to be taking part in reconnaissance and sabotage operations as part of the ongoing war effort. All the while, they fit neatly into the Russian military apparatus while openly parading themselves around as neo-Nazis, continually providing evidence against Russia's own claims that its offensive is meant to denazify Ukraine. And if the Rasik Group wasn't bad enough, they're joined on the ideological side of Russia's PMC network by the Russian Imperial Movement, or the RIM. First founded in 2002, the RIM takes a somewhat different tone than the Rasik Group. Instead of being neo-Nazis, they're virulent white supremacists and supporters of Tsarist Russian ethno-nationalism. At first, the RIM was largely a political organization under its founder, Stanislav Vorobayev, but they've since become best known for their armed wing, the so-called Imperial Legion. The RIM got its military start in the years between 2002 and 2010, when a small group of recruits engaged in martial arts and paramilitary training, while their political affiliates were active in far-right Russian circles. But in 2014, the RIM started organizing its own training centers to prepare recruits for service in pro-Russian militias in Ukraine. As the RIM told it at the time, their militarization was born of a desire to rid purported Russian territory of an anti-Russia regime, and since quite literally the day after Russia annexed the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea, the RIM were active in the conflict in Ukraine's Donbass region. The group would become a direct mechanism for interested recruits to get to the Donbass all trained up and ready to fight, and the RIM's own Imperial Legion took an active role in the fighting in Ukraine through at least 2016. After the RIM pulled out of the conflict, they turned their attention to a now thriving training academy known as Partisan. By 2017, hundreds of recruits were passing through Partisan at regular intervals while positioning themselves in a prominent place in the Russian ethno-nationalist movement. Their influence expanded from Russia to post-Soviet states to Europe and even the US, holding conferences attended by global neo-Nazis and white supremacists, and recruits who passed through Partisan would go on to conduct terrorist attacks. In 2017, the RIM even organized a visit to the US and networked with American white supremacists in furtherance of their mutual goals. As Russia began to ramp itself up toward the start of full-scale hostilities in Ukraine, the RIM began deploying its fighters abroad, first to Syria in 2019 and then to Libya, where they showed up in support of breakaway warlord Khalifa Haftar in the civil war there. By 2020, they'd been designated as a terrorist organization by the United States, and when Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine kicked off, RIM-trained fighters have appeared across the conflict. The RIM's own Imperial Legion has operated on the front lines of the war, but they've also occupied another, more unique role as a PMC, the continued large-scale training of new recruits through Partisan even through 2023. They've become known for their top-tier performances in inter-organization military contests and shooting competitions, while they stand out for their abundance of heavy weaponry, armored vehicles, and advanced and highly varied small arms. Rather than being responsible for operations abroad, for which Russia hopes to evade responsibility, Partisan and the RIM appear to be focused on work at home that Russia doesn't want to claim as their own. The training of ideologically extreme military recruits who can go on, take up arms, and cause chaos as partisans in Ukraine and around the world. And finally, we move on to one of the newest entries in Russia's PMC architecture, the companies formed on behalf of Russian state gas company Gazprom. At present, Gazprom is believed to run 2 primary PMCs of their own, a battalion called Fakel, meaning torch, and a battalion called Potok, or stream. Some reports suggest that they've got a third group, Plamya, or Flame, although that unit's status is far hazier at present. Together, Fakel and Potok maintain murky links with the Redut PMC that we mentioned before, with some analysts believing that they've been integrated into Redut, while others believe that Redut is fully or partially responsible for their recruitment drives, but doesn't hold powers of oversight over them. Fakel and Potok recruit their fighters primarily from within the Gazprom organization itself, which was estimated in 2018 to have no fewer than 450,000 employees around the world. Between Gazprom's massive numbers of personnel and their ability to draw in money, with revenues of nearly $90 billion estimated in 2020, Gazprom is one of the world's largest companies. With that money, they can pay their mercenaries very well, while keeping their paramilitary protection basically in-house and sending their employees back to work in their day jobs when they rotate out of employment with Fakel and Potok. It's a pretty sweet gig for military veterans and Russian fans of first-person shooters. You play Army for a couple of years while being relatively unlikely to deploy into active combat, and then go back to work for one of the richest companies on the globe. But that being said, it's also not unheard of for Fakel and Potok troops to deploy to Ukraine, where at least one unit was involved in the protracted fighting in and around the city of Bakhmut in 2023. In practice, Gazprom workers who've spoken to Western sources have indicated that recruitment into these 2 groups has been somewhat less of a matter of volunteering and more of a matter of taking instructions from one's employer. In one account provided to the Financial Times, a Gazprom security manager at one installation in central Russia gathered his employees and stated that at least 2 men among them would have to volunteer for combat in exchange for pay raises, equipment, and a holiday upon their return. In another account from Siberia, Gazprom employees were asked one by one to volunteer in exchange for 1 million rubles, enough to produce a major change in their circumstances. Since that time, Gazprom's recruitment methods may have changed. Those stories came from a time when Russia was desperate to find bodies willing to serve in and around Bakhmut, while the war has since settled into more of a stalemate. But that initial recruitment push likely indicates that Fakel and Potok are not simply small bands of fighters anymore, and that at least a portion of their current soldiers have picked up valuable combat experience. It probably shouldn't be a surprise that for an organization like these 2, most of their work for their corporate benefactor basically comes down to guard duty, defending fixed assets like oil refineries and drilling fields in areas where they might be attacked, sabotaged, or otherwise threatened. In the West, Exxon and BP have similar groups at their disposal. But it's not just Gazprom's foreign assets that need guarding. The economic and military tensions of the Russian invasion of Ukraine have exposed a cutthroat factionalism within the ranks of Russia's elite power players, and corporate sabotage, theft, and even skirmishes between rival oligarchs' private armies are all becoming an increasingly common part of the game. Gazprom in particular is very important to lock down from that kind of interference. After all, the Russian state and war effort are both deeply dependent on the company, as is Vladimir Putin and his personal power base. Gazprom CEO Alexei Miller has his own fair share of enemies, the now deceased Wagner head Yevgeny Prigozhin and several surviving members of Putin's private inner circle. Fakel and Potok's existence represents a potentially growing shift inside Russia's PMC network. Gazprom is opting into competition in a tight market, fighting for a limited number of recruits and arms alongside all the other PMCs in the Russian military. They've got to build a full training and support infrastructure in order to make their mercenary wing functional. Gazprom's willingness to pay out indicates that the deterrence and protection that they provide is worth the cost, and that in turn indicates that Gazprom decision-makers don't anticipate Russia's power ecosystem getting any less venomous anytime soon. Instead, they're making a long-term investment into placing a military unit directly under their own control in anticipation that one day they'll be thankful that they had Fakel and Potok at their disposal. As hostilities in Russia's war with Ukraine continue to wax and wane with each passing day, Russia's use of paramilitary groups seems to be growing even despite the decline of Wagner. Analysts and onlookers around the world have rightly questioned whether we're looking at the new normal here. We should emphasize too that we've only discussed a fraction of the Russian PMCs currently in operation, with more and more seeming to crop up by the day. But even despite the continued rise of PMCs in the Russian strategic outlook, we've still got a key question to ask here. Are PMCs really worth it? One reason why not is fairly clear to see. For anyone who's watched the Russia-Ukrainian war with any level of interest in 2023, mercenaries get paid, and when mercenaries get paid, they're under control until they're not. No matter what way you slice it, the Wagner Group's 2023 attempt to capture senior Russian Ministry of Defense officials and their subsequent march on Moscow was a valuable reminder to Vladimir Putin and his advisors that PMCs are not as reliable as they claim. They are their own entities, their own in-groups, and if they're allowed to amass enough military power, then it might be a mistake to piss them off. What that means for Russia's current PMCs, we can't say for sure, although it's clear that Russia's efforts to shut down Wagner haven't led to the shutdown of all PMCs. If anything, it's created a vacuum for those other PMCs to grow stronger. But how strong they're allowed to be is likely going to be a metric that Russia watches a whole lot closer in the years to come. And then there's the capacity for division and even violence between the PMCs themselves. That's a phenomenon that has already been seen around the devastated Ukrainian city of Bakhmut, where members of various PMCs, including Wagner, engaged in both pissing contests about whose guns were better and very real disputes about how military engagements were handled. In what is already becoming a lawless world of private paramilitaries, it's not inconceivable that an exceptionally cutthroat environment could develop between the PMCs. Every new Russian demand for a force of 300 to guard a diamond mine might lead to infighting, brawls, or even targeted kidnapping or assassination between paramilitaries hunting for that contract. And if that sort of violence goes on long enough, then it's entirely possible that individual PMCs might choose to throw down in order to settle their disputes. If that happens on the soil of one of Russia's foreign partners, then that partner isn't going to be happy. And if it happens on the streets of Moscow or St. Petersburg, the consequences could be even more dire. So as we conclude today's video, with us left to ask the final open question in all of this. If Russia decides that PMCs are worth their continued trouble, and that does seem to be Russia's current verdict, then what does that PMC ecosystem actually look like? Does the task of maintaining Russia's hegemony eventually turn into a bidding war between bounty hunters, with each job auctioned off to whichever freelancer secures that day's contract? Does one group start making moves and power plays, pushing others out of the market and swelling their ranks? Do PMCs become a sort of fashionable thing to have among Russia's class of oligarchs, as important as a yacht or a mansion? Or do they become closer and closer to Russian military and intelligence, operating as explicit extensions of the Russian state's will so that Vladimir Putin can better keep them in check? How Russia's flirtation with PMCs eventually shakes out, we simply won't know until we see it happen. In fact, we might not see it at all. After all, the entire point of their existence is to keep these Russian internal matters hidden from view and ensure that Russia projects its global influence in ways that look as if it was never there. But whatever happens next, however it goes, Russia's PMC legion doesn't look like it's about to start shrinking. By the day, it grows larger and larger still, even as Russia's traditional influence across the world seems to be diminishing. Take that to its logical conclusion, and PMC Legion may eventually become PMC Nation. We're just gonna have to wait and find out.